I would like to start my presentation by expressing my gratitude for extending the invitation to me to speak on issues surrounding transgender policy and law. I'm aware that the legal promotion of transgender ideology in Korea is still quite embryonic, but is growing in influence that needs to be addressed sooner than later. Now, one of the best ways to do that, as the organizers of this talk have recognized, is studying how the phenomenon has risen to such prominence in other jurisdictions. For my part, I hope to assist you with that task today by examining the situation in Europe and the United Kingdom. It is fair to say that in many ways, Western Europe is facing an ideological crisis. A new morality has swept the political class, which creates a false idol of personal autonomy. It is not a particularly new phenomenon. In many ways, it began in 1789 with the French Revolution. Perhaps even before that with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, both who died a decade before they could see their ideas take on life and eventually take the lives of more than 50,000 people in 1793. Arguably, the most recognized figure of the French Revolution, someone who himself found the fate of the guillotine, Maximilien Robespierre, famously said that my liberty stops only where my neighbor's liberty begins. Now, this movement also became the genesis for today's human rights worldview, which places far too much weight on personal rights and not nearly enough emphasis on the common good or personal responsibility. Along the way, other philosophers grew up which either complemented or manipulated the ideas of the French Revolution. Marxism, perhaps, is the most famous one of them. So too was Gramsciism, a form of social Marxism, which argues that the power structures of religion, Christianity, family, education, media, and government uphold the authority of the ruling class. Now, like the French Revolution, Gramsci demanded radical equality, which required the creation of an alternative power structure. Now, the existing pillars of moral and social authority, such as Christianity and the natural family, had to be infiltrated and recreated in the Marxist image. In the 20th century, this school of thought became entrenched in the universities in Western Europe, Canada, and the United States. In the West, when we think of the 1960s, we think of the sexual revolution. Most people are unaware of the nefarious philosophical underpinnings of that revolution and its poisonous fruits. Philosophically, the sexual revolution was a combination of many worldviews. There were certainly elements of Voltaire in it. There were undoubtedly elements of Gramsci and the philosophers who brought his work into the 20th century, commonly referred to as the Frankfurt School. Bentian utilitarianism can be found there as well. Now, Jeremy Bentham believed that the purpose of life was pleasure, specifically that our goal in life should be to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. So within the context of the sexual revolution, this can mean hedonism, sexual experimentation, and the practice of any vice which brings pleasure so long as it's not done to such an extreme that it can cause suffering. Now, Bentham's vision of life's purpose also has had profound effects on how we define human dignity, which traditionally has been a Christian concept, particularly as relates to end-of-life matters. So euthanasia proponents, for example, also argue that there is dignity in dying where life no longer gives a person pleasure. So again, the whole purpose of life and the way we derive dignity is through pleasure. And there's no spiritual component in it. Out of the sexual revolution also came more modern theories, many of which are now currently in vogue, those of radical feminism and LGBT liberation, for example. Deconstructionism and postmodernity have also become popularized. The belief that social concepts and social structures are created and therefore can be deconstructed. So within the context of LGBT theory, this would include heteronormativity, which is the belief that heterosexuality is the norm and that other forms of sexual attraction are lesser. It also would include deconstruction of the traditional family. Now, the traditional family is founded in marriage, which is defined on three pillars. The first is permanence. That is the idea that marriage exists, as we say in our wedding vows, until death do us part. It's permanent. Once you enter it, you're in it for life. The second pillar is exclusivity. That is that the partners in a marriage are faithful to each other. This is otherwise known as monogamy. And finally, that marriage is family-centered. when we marry, the marriage should be less about the individuals in it and more about the whole, which should be focused on raising children. Now, as a culture, we have already largely destroyed this concept of marriage. Through liberal divorce laws, family is now far from permanent. With the sexualization of our culture and the mainstreaming of pornography, most marriages are no longer monogamous. And because we now live in a culture which idolizes the self and the pursuit of pleasure, marriage is far too often not focused on the children. Now, as a concept emptied of its social goods, social activists were able to redefine marriage to include same-sex couples. The emergence of same-sex marriage as a staple of Western culture has had a massive psychological and philosophical impact on how we view the world. Now, one of the hallmarks of marriage was biological complementarity, that a man and a woman have different but complementary reproductive systems that, when brought together, create human life. Once same-sex marriage became normalized, so too did the idea that a family can come in any number of forms, including a child having same-sex parents. Technology such as in vitro fertilization and surrogacy arrangements could allow same-sex couples to have biologically related children. Adoption, of course, is also an option to same-sex couples. The point is that all of these changes in the social fabric have had a knock-on effect, which has completely redefined our concept of family. On a similar trajectory, the sexual revolution mainstreamed contraception and abortion. It was believed that allowing women to have sex without getting pregnant or allowing them to end their pregnancy by abortion would lead to sexual liberation and the equality of the sexes. The birth control pill was allowed for use in the UK from 1961, but at that time it was exclusively allowed to married women only. Interestingly, contraception was mainstreamed to all women in 1967, the same year that the United Kingdom legalized abortion. In many ways, 1967 was a watermark year in the UK. It changed the culture dramatically, and the UK has never been the same. Now, this experiment, I would suggest, has failed miserably. The UK leads Europe in the area of teenage pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. As a culture, it went from a place where families were stable, with only 4.6% of children being born outside of wedlock when Queen Elizabeth took her throne. That number is now an astounding 48.1% of children being born outside of marriage. There has been a 600% increase in divorce in the UK as well. Instead of trying to reclaim a healthy marriage culture, the UK has created no-fault divorce laws, making it easier than ever to divorce. Interestingly, the highest rate of divorce is now among same-sex couples. The number of abortions in the UK has increased tenfold since 1967, and every year, despite the mainstreaming of contraception, the UK reaches new records in the amount of abortions performed. The total since 1967 is now more than 9 million unborn children having been aborted. Family stability has also fared badly, with more and more children being taken into state care because of neglect and other social problems. Since 2006, there's been a 150% increase in children taken into state care, leading to the president of the family division of our courts in the UK to identify the problem of social services care as a scandal and a crisis. Now, all of this has, as you would imagine, had a huge impact on churches as well. The secularization of the culture, the embracing of this idea of the sexual revolution and personal autonomy has really emptied out our churches. We have less attendance historically than ever. Many church properties are now being sold, used as nightclubs or other venues. So it's quite a shocking thing. Moreover, with the introduction of our Equality Act in the UK, the impact on individual Christians has been astronomical. At the Christian Legal Center where I work, we have had this year alone over 900 Christians contact us and ask us for advice because they've suffered some form of impact and detriment because of their Christian faith. We have over 40 cases right now before the courts on behalf of Christians who have, again, suffered some kind of detriment, whether it be fined, arrested, losing their job because of their Christian faith. Now, all of this information I've just provided you is the backdrop in which transgender theory has begun to flourish in the United Kingdom. Not too many years in the recent past, it would have been unthinkable that a culture could deconstruct biological sex. But given the last minutes of my presentation, where we have looked at the deconstruction of the family, of marriage, of sexual norms, we can see how we've gotten to where we are in the UK today. Now, it is difficult to identify just one source, the birth of the gender identity movement. Ironically, the feminist movement, which in many ways has become the fiercest opponent of the transgender movement, gave trans theorists their early foundations by arguing that gender roles were social constructs and not based on biological realities. This rather innocent observation can easily be manipulated to suggest that since gender is socially constructed, our innate feeling of gender does not necessarily have to equate to our biological sex. In that sense, if the brain and the biological reality of one's sex do not match, medicine and free will allows us to align the two by altering physical sex characteristics through surgery, hormonal therapy, or taking on the characteristics of the opposite sex, such as mannerisms and wardrobe choices. It was more than just feminism which played a part, however. In the 1950s, the concept of gender was also introduced by Dr. John Money in order to facilitate his plans to manipulate the sexual identity of patients with what we now call gender dysphoria. His suggested treatments, which included the first sex change operations, failed and were subsequently appropriately discredited. That same university where Dr. Money worked, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, eventually stopped performing sex reassignment operations until only recently. Dr. Money's best known patient was a gentleman named Bruce Reimer, a boy with an identical twin. Now, Bruce accidentally had his penis cut off as an infant and was thereafter from a young age raised and affirmed as a girl named Brenda Reimer. So in accordance with Dr. Money's directions that included hormone replacement therapy and estrogen, Dr. Money claimed in his book, Man and Woman, Boy and Girl, that the experiment had been a complete success, despite not having had contact with Brenda for over 20 years. Now, despite his claims of success, Dr. Money had really no idea of the long-term repercussions of the experiment on the child as he became an adult. In actuality, Brenda became Dave Reimer, husband and father of 3 children. Now, the patient had resisted from almost the beginning the efforts to transition him into a girl, even insisting on peeing standing up, and was told by his parents on the advice of the psychiatrist at the age of 15, after much suffering that he had gone through, that he had in fact been born a boy. Now, Mr. Reimer reported tremendous relief at this revelation. He was deeply scarred by Dr. Money's therapy sessions, which included, believe it or not, acting out sexual intercourse with his identical twin brother in Dr. Money's presence to assert Brenda's femininity. Tragically, Mr. Reimer killed himself later in life. Now, despite Dr. Money's failures, the unethical nature of many of his experiments, sometimes where there was no informed consent by the patients, his ideology enjoyed a rebirth with the creation of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. Now, this association, together with numerous trans campaigning organizations, have had a tremendous impact on forming laws and policies which punish any opposition to their ideas as being transphobic. Now, the formula behind the success of their campaigning has been premised on a fairly simple strategy. The first step is to highlight the vulnerability and social problems facing transgendered people, putting all of the blame on transphobia and lack of social acceptance. Second, as I've already noted, trans campaigners shut down anyone, whether it be contrary academic views or public expressions of opinion, as being transphobic. Opposition to their campaigning points, they argue, is part of the problem and not part of the solution. Third, diligent efforts are made to create broadly worded anti-discrimination laws which can be used as a sword to chop down any opposition to the trans worldview. I think you're seeing this now in Korea with the discussions about your own Equality Act. It's certainly been true in the UK. Fourth, and as will be discussed in the next part of the presentation, is to entrench transgender theory into primary and secondary education of children. So the reality is far less straightforward. It is true that transgender people suffer far more many social woes than the rest of the population, but much of that suffering cannot be laid at the feet of others on the premise that it is solely based on lack of social acceptance. Now, the statistical data regarding transgender experiences is actually incredibly worrying. So, for example, the National Center for Transgender Equality published the results of an exhaustive survey on American transgender people in 2015, which analyzed their self-reported experiences. The survey revealed that 40% of the 27,715 people surveyed admitted to attempting suicide, with 7% having attempted suicide within 12 months of the survey. The attempted suicide rate of those from unsupportive households was a shocking 54%, that being more than half. 39% reported serious psychological stress just in the month prior to completing the survey. The rates of HIV among those surveyed was 5 times higher than the national average in the United States, 1.4% versus 0.3% of those who were not transgender. 12% of those surveyed admitted to having prostituted themselves, with 5% of the respondents having done so within 12 months of completing the survey. The report also evidenced astronomically higher rates of domestic violence, victimization, poverty, unemployment, and homelessness. Now, given all of this, government certainly has a very compelling reason to look at the transgendered issue very carefully. Now, unfortunately, in the West, it really hasn't done that. Legislators and policymakers have largely accepted the arguments put forth by transgender campaigners that all that needs to be done is to provide unfettered acceptance of transgendered people by force of the law. After all, it's easier to take on board the views of campaigners and appear to be doing something about the issue rather than actually taking the effort to look at the root causes of the problem. It's also far easier to just acquiesce to the demands of the trans lobby than to risk publicly being labeled as being hateful or transphobic. I would argue that far too many people in positions of authority, including in our universities and public health institutions, have skirted their responsibility on this issue for the purpose of protecting their own reputations. In doing so, they've allowed an ideology into our schools, which is having a serious and nefarious effect on our children. In the next part of my presentation, I will be discussing exactly this, the impact of transgender ideology in UK schools. Let's turn to that issue now.